Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Saratoga Springs Public Library. My name is Terry Blasco and I'm the local history librarian here at the library. Before we get started, just the usual reminders. Please make sure your cell phones are turned off. And if you need to use the restrooms during the program, you can exit the doors that you came in and you'll see the restrooms down at the end of the hallway. Today's program was made possible by Grant Cottage, which will hold its annual Remembrance Day tomorrow at the Cottage from 12:30 to 4 p.m. This event acknowledges the death of Ulysses S. Grant on Mount McGregor on July 23, 1885. There will be historic figures representing the Grant family as well as members of the Sons of the Union Veterans at this program tomorrow at the Cottage. It's going to be a gorgeous day, so I hope some of you are going to be able to take advantage of that, or all of you could take advantage of that. At 1 o'clock, Mr. Flood will give a talk and a book signing at the Cottage. So again, I think it's going to be a great event, and hopefully a lot of you will be able to attend. We are thrilled to have Charles Flood with us today. He will be giving a reading following my introduction. He'll be giving the reading from his recent work, Grant's Final Victory. I see a lot of familiar faces here, so I'm sure most of you know that part of that time that is covered in the book was spent at what is now Grant Cottage, the Drexel Cottage on Mount McGregor. Charles Bracelen Flood was born in Manhattan and graduated from Harvard, where he was a member of Archibald MacLeish's noted creative writing seminar, English S, and was on the literary board of the Harvard Lampoon. In 2001, Flood was honored with the Lampoon's Clem Wood Award, joining the company of George Plimpton, John Updike, and Conan O'Brien. Love is a Bridge, Flood's first novel, received nationwide critical attention and was on the New York Times bestseller list for 26 weeks. His other novels include A Distant Drum and More Lives Than One. Before his foray into the Civil War era, Charles Flood wrote The War of the Innocents, his account of his years spent in Vietnam as a correspondent, Rise and Fight Again, which won the American Revolution Roundtable Annual Award in 1976, and Hitler, The Path to Power. Flood's first venture into the Civil War era was Lee, The Last Years, which was a Book of the Month Club selection and won the Colonial Dames of America Annual Book Award. Lee was followed by Grant and Sherman, The Friendship That Won the Civil War, which Salon.com named as one of the top 12 Civil War books ever written. Of his book, 1864, Lincoln at the Gates of History, Kent Masterson Brown, author of Retreat from Gettysburg, said, "Lincoln walks off the pages as in no other book." Charles Flood's short pieces have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Esquire, and other magazines, and a number of his books have been translated into foreign languages. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Charles Bracelen Flood.
Thank you very much, Terry. And the only thing I hesitate to call it a correction, but it's a piece of good news. I'm not going to do a reading. I'm going to give you a talk about the book, not a reading from the text. And somebody's applauding, and you're right. And I do want to say just a couple of personal words. This is my second trip up to Saratoga Springs. And 2 years ago, my son Curtis and I went up to the Cottage and had a very good conducted tour. And when I came back from all that, told Kathy what a beautiful part of the world it was. And I also have to say now, in less than 24 hours in our second time here, we're from Kentucky. We pride ourselves on our southern hospitality, but the hospitality we've received so far in less than 24 hours is fully equal to anything we can think about coming up with. So I also want to just thank a couple of people, and there'll be more to thank tomorrow at the Cottage. But I want to thank not only Terry, but also Hattie Finch, Tim Welch, and Dave Hubbard, all of whom have played parts in getting me here and getting it all organized and having the thing go off to this point till I start speaking absolutely flawlessly. So without any more words on this, I'll say, launch into my talk to you. My book begins in May of 1864, 19 years after Appomattox. Grant is 62 years old and the most famous man in America. He's also on his way to being the most photographed man of the 19th century. In addition to his enormous contribution to winning the Civil War, he has served 2 terms as President of the United States. Can you all hear me up to this point? All right.
Lift up the microphone a bit.
What?
Lift up the microphone a bit.
Move it towards me? Lift it up. Okay, I'll do just that. Thank you. Grant was not in good health. Among other things, this man of slender build had gained 40 pounds since his wartime weight of 146 pounds. He used crutches as a result of falling on an icy New York sidewalk. However, no one, including Grant, had any idea that he had only 14 months left to live. As we open on Grant, he and his wife, Julia, are living very comfortably in New York City. They are able to afford this lifestyle because of the generosity and support of some rich New Yorkers, including J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and William H. Vanderbilt. These men and others like them saw in Grant the same kind of vision and determination that had brought them success in their own fields. Vanderbilt, then the richest man in the world with a fortune of $194 million, said of Grant, "He is one of us." My plan now is to take you back to the beginning of Grant's life and give you some of the highlights on his way through to 1884. I want to give you the man as he really was, rather than as he's been so often described. Grant has been portrayed as humorless, a person who would never laugh at himself. He was tone deaf, knew it, and said, "I know 2 tunes. One is Yankee Doodle and the other isn't." Grant was the son of the operator of a small tannery in Ohio and graduated from West Point. After serving with distinction in the Mexican War, he married Julia Dent, the highly intelligent, vivacious, cross-eyed daughter of a pre-war slave-holding family in Missouri. The Civil War historian Bruce Catton called their marriage one of the great romantic American love stories, and there is a lot in my book to support that estimate of their union. Now, separated from Julia while serving in a remote army post on the Pacific coast, he became desperately lonely and was drunk on duty during a payday in 1854. Now, it's not really very nice to make fun of somebody else's personal difficulty and tragedy, but at that time, the troops were being paid in coins. And the image that rises for me is Grant drunk, managing to knock over stacks of coins in every direction. So his colonel gave him the option of facing a court-martial or resigning from the army. Grant resigned. 7 years later, when the Civil War began in 1861, he returned to the army. Starting as commander of a regiment with less than 1,000 men, he rose to become the general-in-chief of the entire Union Army, a force of more than 1 million men. And in the process, and here is a point that so many have missed, he became a transitional figure in the history of warfare. At Shiloh in 1862, he was riding back and forth right behind the lines of his infantrymen who were firing at the nearby Confederate ranks. By the time that Abraham Lincoln brought him east in 1864 to command the entire Union Army and to oppose Robert E. Lee in Northern Virginia, he was communicating with his corps commanders by telegraph from his headquarters miles behind the front. Contrary to the myth that he was often drunk, at no time during the war was he incapable of effective action due to consuming alcohol. During his meteoric rise among Union generals, Grant not only developed enormous administrative skills, but became a great strategist. More than any other general on either side, he understood that the rivers of the South were an integral part of a vast battlefield area and could be used as avenues for penetrating and cutting up the South. Lincoln described him this way: once Grant gets hold of a place, he acts as if he had inherited it. I have written down at the top of this page, whether you think so or not, take a drink of water. So I have. Among the great mistaken impressions of Grant is that he really wasn't very bright. During the last year of the war, he created and incorporated into his headquarters at City Point, Virginia, what he called the Bureau of Military Information. Now that's a pretty innocuous phrase. I mean, I could see at a current military base today, the Office of Public Information, Military, so forth. This was, in fact, a sophisticated and highly effective 64-man intelligence gathering unit, and it surpassed anything that the Confederates ever organized. While it's true that Grant spilled a lot of blood in his frontal attacks on Robert E. Lee's stalwart forces, it's also worth remembering what Lee thought about that. When Lee's subordinates were telling him about the way that Grant was recklessly piling up casualties, Lee replied, "I think General Grant is managing things very well." Now, virtually every American knows the story of the way in which Ulysses S. Grant set new standards of military honor by the kind and gracious way in which he accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. But many are unaware of what came next. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, intended to have Lee tried for treason, a crime punishable by death. Grant walked into the White House and told Johnson that Lee was protected by the parole that he, Grant, had given Lee and all his men at Appomattox. Grant added that if Lee were arrested, he would immediately resign from the Army in protest and let the public know why he did it. Johnson and his federal prosecutors did not intend to argue with the immensely popular, victorious commanding general of the United States Army. They quietly halted the treason proceedings. Lee was never arrested. For the remaining 5 years of Lee's life, he never allowed a word against Grant to be spoken in his presence. In 1869, 4 years after the war ended, Grant was sworn in as President of the United States, a position he held for 2 terms. His first term was a success, and his second was not. During his second term, his political opponents launched 37 investigations into corruption in his administration. Despite their efforts, they could not demonstrate that he was involved in any of the scandals, many of them resulting from the politically naive Grant's misplaced trust in those he believed to be honest men. Taking an action unique in American political history, presidential history, and political history as well. In Grant's final message to Congress, later called the State of the Union Address, he apologized to the nation's legislators and through them to the American people for his inadequacies as president. Grant began with this: "It was my fortune or misfortune to be called to the office of Chief Magistrate without any political training. It is but reasonable to assume that errors in judgment must have occurred." He added that he claimed, quote, "only that I have acted in every instance from a desire to do what was right, constitutional within the law, and for the very best interest of the whole people." As for ending slavery, Grant paid this tribute to the enactment of the 15th Amendment, which was designed to protect the right of blacks to vote. Now, since many of you have a feeling for words, I'm going to just mention this. With a stately eloquence equal to some of Lincoln's best phrasing, now we'll get to Grant's phrasing in a moment, so let's try the immortal, with malice toward none, with charity for all, okay? There's a rhythm, a beat, Great words, immortal words. Now try Grant. I don't think it falls far short. A measure which makes at once 4 million voters who are heretofore declared by the highest tribunal in the land to be not citizens of the United States, nor eligible to become so, is indeed a measure of grander importance than any other act of the kind from the foundation of our free government to the present day. Now, it's worth noting that in the recent and long overdue movement among biographers and historians to restore Grant to his rightful place in American history, Professor Sean Willents of Princeton takes the position that Grant did more for civil rights than any other president between Lincoln and Lyndon B. Johnson. And here I'm going to digress again, because I've recently read a really wonderful biography of Dwight Eisenhower by a man named Gene Edward Smith, who in my judgment has written in the past the best single biography of Grant. And I understand that you're going to have a porch discussion at the Grant Cottage fairly soon about Eisenhower and Grant. And I'm sure there's going to be discussion about, I presume, about their performance as generals, presumably something about their performance as presidents, but I'm hoping when that day comes that maybe somebody will explore in a way that I can't right now whether you couldn't have said any other president between Grant and Dwight Eisenhower. Now, once more, I want to bring the less known side of Grant to your attention. After his White House days in 1879, Ulysses S. Grant and his wife Julia embarked on a 2-year trip around the world. Planned as a private sightseeing journey, and here I have to digress again for a moment, the naivete of Grant, thinking he could, prowl around Europe, looking at the great monuments, cathedrals, and so forth of Europe, as a private citizen, was just naive. Great crowds greeted them everywhere they went. Nothing planned in advance, just the word got out anywhere that Grant and his wife were in town, and crowds flocked to where he was going to be or where they thought he was going to be. In any event, it planned as a private sightseeing journey, it turned into an immense international tribute to Grant. He symbolized the burgeoning post-Civil War America, an industrial and military power to be reckoned with. He and Julia dined with Queen Victoria at Windsor Palace. In Berlin, he spent 2 hours with Germany's Iron Chancellor, Prince Otto von Bismarck, who Grant characterized as, quote, the greatest statesman of the present time. Bismarck treated him with great respect as a military and national leader who possessed first-hand knowledge that he, Bismarck, was eager to acquire. Now here we go, I think, something, again, not too many of you may know about. Grant impressed not only European leaders. After he and Julia visited China and Japan before crossing the Pacific, the governments of both nations entrusted him with what proved to be the successful settlement of a territorial boundary dispute involving the Ryukyu Islands. So all this brought Grant and Julia to what neither of them thought would be the last chapter of his life. The year of 1884 found them living in Manhattan in a handsome townhouse just east of the fabulous millionaires' mansions on Fifth Avenue. This was the era in our history known as the Gilded Age. More water. Grant and his son Ulysses S. Grant Jr. had become partners in a Wall Street investment firm known as Grant & Ward. The moving spirit of this enterprise was Ferdinand Ward, known as the young Napoleon of Wall Street. Trustingly, Grant had put all his money under Ward's management and had encouraged all of his immediate family to follow his example. At that moment, Ward was showing prospective investors papers indicating that the firm had a capitalization of $7 million. On that, I beg your pardon, $16 million. On that basis, Grant had reason to think he was personally worth, as he put it, and this is real Grantese, nigh on to $1 million. This at a time when household servants were paid $5 a week. The financial catastrophe struck swiftly. Overnight, in May of 1884, Ward's fraudulent financial house of cards collapsed. He had been running what a later generation would call a Ponzi scheme, and even more recently we would call the machinations of Bernie Madoff. Grant and his family lost all their money. A description of Grant as he was at this juncture was left by Robert Underwood Johnson, a brilliant young editor on the staff of the Century magazine, which then was a thinking person's magazine of wide circulation. Johnson met with Grant at his and Julia's summer cottage in Long Branch, New Jersey, to discuss the possibility of his writing articles about his famous battles and campaigns. Johnson found a man far different from the gruff warrior he expected to encounter. He wrote, "The man who, we had been told, was stolid and reserved, showed himself to me as a person of the most sensitive nature and the most human expression of feeling. Grant, quote, gave me the impression of a wounded lion. He had been hurt to the quick in his proud name and his honor. He told me frankly and simply that he had arrived at Long Branch almost penniless. At Long Branch, Julia, who for 8 years had had the White House staff at her disposal, did all the cooking for her Ulysses, as she called him, and their family and guests. With Johnson guiding him, Grant began to write about Shiloh, the first of 4 articles describing his victorious battles. He found that he enjoyed it, and Johnson was the first to discover that the same man who could write the clearest, most direct military orders and after-action reports was capable of descriptive writing that transported a reader into the middle of gunfire and the neighing of cavalry horses. As Grant focused his prodigious powers of concentration on the 4 articles for the Century, he began to think of expanding this initial effort into what became his massive and powerful personal memoirs. It was now that Grant's friend Mark Twain entered the picture. Twain, already greatly famous for his adventures of Tom Sawyer and other works, was about to publish Huckleberry Finn. He made Grant an offer that was both generous to Grant and, although speculative, potentially very lucrative for himself. He would publish Grant's memoirs through a small publishing firm run by Twain's nephew, Charles Webster, and give Grant $200,000 as an advance on the venture. Twain, always a man for images, and here they come, described the arrangement this way: if these chickens should ever hatch, General Grant's royalties will amount to $420,000 and will make the largest single check ever paid to an author in the world's history. If I pay the general in silver coin at $12 per English pound, it will weigh 17 tons. So you see a little switch in images there, but there we are. Chickens, pounds, silver, tons. So as Grant continued writing in the summer of 1884, he suffered increasing pain and discomfort in his mouth. By late October, this had been diagnosed as cancer, primarily of the tongue, the result of smoking literally thousands of cigars. This was in fact a death sentence. The dramatic question now facing Grant and the American public when they later learned of it was, could he complete his memoirs before he died? During the spring of 1885, as Grant pushed himself ever harder, as he wrote in his house in Manhattan, the people of both the North and the South, while still divided concerning post-war political issues, began to come together in an example of the American respect for courage and the native instinct to pull for the underdog. Mark Twain had been right in thinking that Grant could recount his Civil War experiences effectively, but he was bowled over by what he now saw and read. Averaging a production of 750 words a day, while in a condition in which he likened a drink of water to molten lead, Grant was putting on paper a work of remarkable literary quality. Twain compared these memoirs with Julius Caesar's commentaries, saying, "The same high merits distinguished both books: clarity of statement, directness, simplicity, manifest truthfulness, fairness and justice to friend and foe alike, and avoidance of flowery speech." General Grant's book is a great unique, and unapproachable literary masterpiece. There is no higher literature than these modern, simple memoirs. Their style, is flawless. No man can improve upon it. During these months, it became evident that Americans, not only in the North but the South, had come to have a special feeling for Grant. He had always had his critics, but other than during his White House years, he was referred to and thought of as General Grant, not President Grant. Learning of his grave illness, crowds often gathered outside his house on East 66th Street. When he sometimes appeared to go for a carriage ride in Central Park, the reactions would range from applause to solemn silence, with men in the crowds taking off their hats. At the time of Grant's 63rd birthday, on April 27, 1885, 20 years after the nation's great redemptive moment at Appomattox Courthouse, it was clear that a new generation, not born at the time of the surrender, was growing up with an inbuilt feeling toward a man who, like Lincoln, had preserved the Union. Typical of the letters he received from young people was this one from Maggie Irving of Louisville, Kentucky, a border state during the war. She said in part, "I'm a little Louisville girl who likes you so much. Old General Grant, please, please get well. I don't write you to get your autograph or anything of the sort. I only write to let you know how we all love you. I hope you won't suffer a bit. General Grant, please accept the best wishes and love of this little Louisville girl." He also received this birthday greeting from the Confederate Survivors Association meeting in Augusta, Georgia. Quote, "Remembering him now as the generous victor who, at the ever-memorable meeting at Appomattox, conceded liberal and magnanimous terms of surrender, do we, standing by the graves of our Confederate dead, respectfully tender to General Grant assurances of our sincere and profound sympathy in this the season of his direful extremity." Because of the coming summer heat in Manhattan, arrangements were made to take Grant to a cottage high in the hills above Saratoga Springs in upstate New York. An identification I don't have to make here, but I've given this talk as far south as Nashville, Tennessee, over to Boston, etc. At what was known as Mount McGregor, a big new resort hotel named the Balmoral had been built, and this cottage was down a slope some 200 yards from it. Here Grant dug in for what was literally a do-or-die effort. Finding that writing with a pen and ink exhausted him in his weakened condition, he resorted to dictating as he neared the end of his massive 2-volume work. At one point, he had a brief discussion with his oldest son, Frederick, concerning the dedication. Grant had it as, "These volumes are dedicated to the American soldier and sailor." Frederick suggested that this should be changed to specify that he meant the soldiers and sailors who had fought for the North. Grant replied, "It is a great deal better that it should be dedicated as it is. As it is, the dedication is to those we fought against as well as those we fought with. It may serve a purpose in restoring harmony." Grant felt a quiet passion for the nation he had fought to preserve. In what proved to be the last weeks of his life, his mouth and throat choked with mucus and bleeding with from cancer, he sometimes dictated in a barely audible hoarse whisper and finally resorted to writing his thoughts on pieces of paper. On one of these, he wrote a summation of his feelings to former Confederate General Simon Bolivar Buckner of Kentucky, who came to see him at Mount McGregor. "I have witnessed since my sickness just what I wished to see since the war, harmony and good feeling between the sections. I believe myself that the war was worth all that it cost us, fearful as it was. Since it was over, I have visited every state in Europe and a number in the Far East. I know, as I did not know before, the value of our inheritance." On July 20th, 1885, Ulysses S. Grant finished the last changes he wished to make in his manuscript. 3 mornings later, with his family surrounding his bed, his last moments began. He died with Julia holding his hand. A temporary resting place for Grant had been selected in Riverside Park on Manhattan's cliffs high above the Hudson River, and a circular brick mausoleum had been built there. On the day that Grant's coffin, now closed, was brought up there from where he had lain in state downtown in Manhattan City Hall, the largest crowd ever to assemble on the North American continent. Estimates range from 500,000 to 1.5 million people lined the 5-mile route of the funeral procession. What they witnessed was the United States showing the world how to honor a national hero. Thousands of carriages followed the massive horse-drawn catafalque on which Grant's coffin rested. The crowd saw President Grover Cleveland, past Presidents Rutherford B. Hayes and Chester Arthur, and the justices of the Supreme Court. The governors of every state went by in the order in which their states had come into the Union. On the military side, there was a galaxy of generals. 40,000 troops passed, including the West Point Corps of Cadets wearing black armbands. Music was provided by 250, I repeat, 250 bands and drum corps. Proof of how Grant had brought the nation together was the fact that Confederate Generals Joseph E. Johnston and Simon Bolivar Buckner were among the honored participants. The last large segment of the enormous parade, a democracy's tribute to the tanner's son from Ohio, was a walking column of 8,000 elected and appointed officials from all over the United States. The parade's combination of military strength and the representatives of constitutional law, I'm going to repeat that, the parade's combination of military strength and the representatives of constitutional law would have pleased Grant, who believed so firmly in the prosperous future he foresaw for the country he had served. In addition to the public outpouring of respect and affection, those who knew Grant well had their more private reactions. On the day Grant died, Mark Twain wrote in his notebook, "He was a very great man and superlatively good." On their own, many Americans, North and South, realized that they already knew that it was possible to be a sometimes ineffective president, but a great man nonetheless. So what has Grant's legacy been? Despite the rise and fall of historical schools of thought that obscured and diminished his role in our history, he and Lincoln remain the two men who did the most to ensure that our country would remain one nation rather than to become two nations, one of which was committed to maintaining slavery as a legal institution. His memoirs were published to great acclaim, and the sales that Mark Twain had hoped for guaranteed that Julia would live comfortably for the rest of her life. 126 years after Grant finished it, in 2011, the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant sold close to 50,000 copies in 3 hardback and 2 paperback editions. That figure is even more impressive when one considers that the copyright has long since expired and unknown numbers of copies are downloaded free from the internet. And after I'd done most of this book, I asked myself, what other recent example, relatively recent example, can you think of a man who made history and then wrote truly, memorably, and eloquently about it? The only name that comes to my mind is Winston Churchill. So in any case, how do we sum up this unique life? In a speech given 15 years after Grant's death, Theodore Roosevelt placed him in the very first rank of Americans, agreeing that men like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson deserved to be regarded as enormously valuable citizens. He saw Grant as something more than that and spoke of him this way: "As we look back with keener wisdom into the nation's past, mightiest among the mighty dead loom the figures of Washington, Lincoln, and Grant. These 3 greatest men have taken their place among the great men of all nations, the great men of all time. They stood supreme in the 2 greatest crises of our history, on the two great occasions when we stood in the van of humanity and struck the two most effective blows that have ever been struck for human freedom under the law. Of all that was written about Grant, nothing would have pleased him more than Julia's heartfelt and lyric memory of the man she called Ulysses. Julia said, "I, his wife, rested in and was warmed in the sunlight of his loyal love and great fame. And now, even though his beautiful life has gone out, it is as if when some far-off planet disappears from the heavens, the light of his glorious fame still reaches out to me, falls upon me, and warms me." Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it. You're a great audience. Believe me, nobody more than a speaker notices when somebody's foot moves or a heel taps impatiently, somebody looks at their watch. And so now we come to questions and answers, and I love questions and answers, and I sometimes think that it would be nice to have the Q&A before the talk so I know what you're really interested in. However, it doesn't work that way, so I'm going to count on Carrie to cut this off whenever she thinks is appropriate. But I repeat, I like the questions and answers. As far as I'm concerned, just a moment, there's no such thing as a dumb answer, okay? And I learned long ago, a dumb question. And I can give you dumb answers, but I prefer to say I just don't know. And when I faced, and this is about my 4th Civil War related book, I know that in this room there's somebody who knows more about something about the Civil War than I do. So I will just say I don't know if that happens to come up. I think you, yes sir, you with the shirt.
How did you come to become interested in Ulysses S. Grant?
Good question. A question that I would have planted, but fortunately it wasn't necessary to do it. When I wrote my book called Lee the Last Years, which began at Appomattox Courthouse, so Grant was just a really very minor figure of a major figure of the beginning scenes of the book, but pretty much vanished thereafter. And but he always stayed in my mind. And years later, I wanted to write about Grant. I said, but Grant what? Grant how? And then it came to me, Grant and Sherman. Believe it or not, nobody, in all the years that then, I think 115 years since the Civil War, nobody ever thought of linking those two in a book. So there he was again. And then I did a book called Lincoln at the Gates of History, 1864, Lincoln at the Gates of History. There was Grant again. And I still thought, I really want, to do Grant again. I'm not through with it. And so I spoke to a man who died not long thereafter, called John Y. Simon. And he was his life's work was to be the editor of the Papers of Ulysses S. Grant, which is really a monumental work of American scholarship. And so I said, and I felt like a groupie, and I was. I said, Professor Simon, I want to write some more about Grant, but what do you think hasn't been done or done enough, or you'd like to see more of? And his answer, it wasn't cryptic, but he just said, well, what's been written about him gets a little thin towards the end. And I looked, and there had been very little done, very little, in these last 14 months or last year of his life. So off I went. So that's how I got into it and how I stayed in it. I think I am now saying goodbye to General Grant, but it's been a wonderful experience to, I feel, get to know the man, So it's a good question, and I'm glad you asked it. Please, somebody else. Sir.
I hope my information is correct, but I believe...
I'm sorry, can you speak up a little? Yeah, here's the lady with the device.
I hope my information is correct, but I believe after the war, a grateful American nation gave a barrel of cigars as a gift to Grant.
That's not quite correct, okay? After Shiloh, the fact was, before Shiloh, he chewed tobacco and smoked pipes. There's no indication he smoked cigars until Shiloh, and then somebody sent him a case, and I don't know how many were in a case, of cigars. And so being the man he was careful with pennies, he was going to be careful with cigars. He didn't want to, he gave a lot of them away, but he still had a lot of cigars. So he started smoking cigars. And as it happened, somebody saw him, some journalist saw him smoking cigars and just assumed this was Grant, a lifelong habit. Then cigars came pouring in from all over the nation, and so he went on smoking cigars. And so that was the story. I'm unaware of a grateful nation doing anything other than a lot of grateful individuals, but it's an interesting subject, and I'm not sure we'll ever have the precise answer on that. I do hope there'll be some more. Somebody, please. You in the red shirt, sir. Yes.
I have this question. You mentioned that Grant fought in the Mexican War, and so did Robert E. Lee, and that made me wonder if you were aware of any connection between the two of them before the personal connection.
Good question. To the best of my knowledge, Lee, who we remember was already way up, and Winfield Scott called Lee the best man in the field, best soldier he ever saw in the field, and that was based on his performance then. When they met at Appomattox, Grant told Lee he'd seen him a few times, didn't claim they'd ever met, and Lee nodded politely, but it was clear that by that time, believe me, Lee knew who General Ulysses S. Grant was, but he didn't have any memory of seeing him back then. So there's no record of the two of them ever being side by side or anything like that during the Mexican War. I'll go to, there was a lady that had her, yes ma'am, you.
What was Grant's role in, what's the word, Reconstruction in the South?
Well, that's a very, very good question, and I'm a little weak on it. He was on what we think we'd call the side of the angels, and he used the army pretty effectively, but of course it's often been said you don't win the hearts and minds of people by occupying them with bayonets. And so white Southerners' view of Grant during Reconstruction is not quite the view of black people or Northerners, or I think anybody today, but he used the army pretty effectively. The South is and was a very proud place, and the state of Virginia didn't like being renamed administratively, administrative district, military district #1. So the answer is I think he tried, but he was up against a lot of difficulties. That's not a very satisfactory answer to you or to me, but I think that's about the way it was. I think I had another question. Oh, yes, Tim.
Charles, you've written about both Lee and Grant.
Yes, sir.
And I suppose the inevitable question is, how would you compare their generalship during the war?
Great question. Had I planted a question, that would have been another. For tomorrow, too, Tim, okay? So, anyway, that's a very, very good question. I think most people would still give Lee the edge. I would not, because I think that while they both had the disadvantage, they were both men who were brilliant in the warfare of movement, and both of them were tied down in Northern Virginia for various political and economic reasons. And so Lee knew that eventually when they were at loggerheads, Grant could get around his flank, and then it would be just a matter of time. I think Grant had more chances during the war. Who knows what Lee might have done had he other opportunities, but when you get to Grant's Vicksburg campaign, it was brilliant. There was also a campaign within a campaign that I think is, if I were to ever go back to the Civil War, I might try to do this. There came a moment some weeks before Appomattox when Grant said words to the effect, I want to get this over with. That was not the exact words, but anyway. So his final maneuvering of getting Lee to Appomattox Courthouse, of getting him cut off from Joseph E. Johnston, who was trying to come up to join forces with him for a last, probably doomed stand, was really brilliant. So I think just if you could just look at them without all the preconceptions we have, I would give I'd be a minority on this, but I think I would give the edge to Grant. But it's a very, very good, interesting question. Yes, ma'am.
This is a little bit of a trivia question, but I'm just curious if the man who orchestrated the Ponzi scheme...
I'm sorry, speak.
If the man who orchestrated the Ponzi scheme got his comeuppance.
Oh, he did. He went to prison, okay. And his partner, also a man named Fishy business, Fish. Anyway, so Fish, who pretended he didn't know anything about it, But, you know, that it was all Ferdinand Ward who fixed the books, and Fish didn't know a thing about it. He went to prison too. So they did. One for 7 years and one for 6. So they got theirs. Yes, sir, please.
Both Lincoln and Grant married wives who were from slaveholding families, and Lincoln's views on slavery evolved during the Civil War. What was Grant's views of slavery?
Grant, very good question. Grant really, at one point he said, it was like, I don't have a horse, in effect, almost like the words, I don't have a horse in this race. Grant's father was quite an abolitionist. Grant wasn't really that interested in the subject. And during the war, I think, and he sort of took, Lincoln came along quite a way too, you know, during the war. And I think Grant sort of took the policy, he was the implementer, the bloody implementer of policy, but I think he was never as concerned about slavery during the war as some other people were. I think that's about the best I can tell you on that. But he certainly, when it got into the Reconstruction era, he tried, and the quote I gave you and those things, he got to be on the side of the angels, and he was a man who could do something about that. Anybody back there? Yes, sir, way back there. And then I'll come up here.
How did Mrs. Grant survive the widowhood?
Can you relay that?
How did Mrs. Grant survive the death of the president?
Grant? Okay. How did Julia survive her husband's death? Yeah. She, I think very wisely, the family up here where she was, of course, was divided on the subject of who should go down and be in that massive funeral procession. And she, I think very wisely, said, I'm going to stay up here. And the clergyman's wife did stay with her. And I think that was easier on her, certainly, but I think had she been in that parade, who knows, the parade might have come to a complete halt with crowds just crowding around Grant's widow. So I think she did everybody a favor by staying up here and going back to New York somewhat later. Good question. I mean, and very pertinent in light of the whole thing and the connection to here. Still ready? Yes, ma'am, here.
I understand there's a movement to remove Grant from the $50 bill. Have you heard this?
I think that is absolutely nuts, but I mean, you know, there is, I'm aware of the movement, but I think it is just an appalling idea. That's my own feeling. I mean, if any, one of the things that I feel strongly about this is that, you know, there is this revisionist or counter-revisionist movement to get Grant. He belongs to us. If anybody ever belonged to the American people, this was the man from Ohio, the son of the tanner, the man of the yeomanry, you know, the whole works. And if there's an American, in any way you want to start, his family came in 1660 to Massachusetts. You know, this guy belongs to all of us, And I think it's a great shame to in any way chip away. I'm hoping that I'm a very minor part of bringing him back a little more into the national consciousness. So he deserves it and we deserve it. So I'm glad you brought that up too. Good questions, and I'm still ready. Sir, back there. You, sir.
Yes. I wanted to add on the $50. Those who do want to do that, I think some want to replace it with Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. Well, actually,
That's not my question.
yes, that's the question. What do I think of it? What do I?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, sir.
My question is Eisenhower and Grant. The historians who are mostly liberal, presidential historians, traditionally had put Eisenhower very low.
True.
They considered him too passive.
True.
But that is changing now.
That's correct, and rightly so.
He had sort of a hidden hand. He brought down Joe McCarthy. Congratulations.
You're preaching to the converted, and I might add the first 2 votes I ever cast were for Dwight D. Eisenhower. I'm just delighted with this Gene Edward Grant biography, and I urge anybody to do it, and he makes him look ever better. On the other hand, and it also drives some liberal historians crazy too, is that Reagan did spend the Soviet Union into, you know, he laid the way for the wall and the whole works, because he said, we're going to outspend you and you're going to try to stay up with us. And
but I think Gorbachev,
what? I'm sorry.
Gorbachev also had something to do with it.
I'm sorry, say again.
Gorbachev also had something to do with bringing down this.
Who did?
Gorbachev.
Yeah, yes.
My question on Grant is that historians have lifted his reading somewhat. I think the wall.
Indeed, and high time too. High time too. Well, in fact, there's an interesting story, and I won't pretend to know the whole cast of characters here, but it's an interesting story. At the beginning of the 20th century, some historians, particularly at Columbia University in New York, started a school of thought that basically boiled down, we're going to lift up Lee some more. Of course, to the delight of some Southerners, naturally. We're going to lift up Lee some more, and the way we're going to do it is push Grant further down. And I think that was an absolutely nutty concept. I mean, Lee was a great man. Grant was a great man. Why do we play this sort of seesaw act? And as late as the 1990s, some respected, and I forget the name now or I'd give it to you, some respected Northern historian was saying, I don't see how a ruthless butcher like Ulysses S. Grant could look himself in the mirror. Now, Grant lost 7,000 men in the first hour at Cold Harbor. And who was directing the Confederate fire? Robert E. Lee. Does that make him a ruthless butcher? I don't think so. I mean, I think they were generals who took their opportunities to do what they were expected to do. So there you have that as far as I'm concerned. But I think that Grant, for many decades, you saw what Theodore Roosevelt thought of him in 1900. Now you come down the decades of the 20th century, and Grant's reputation gets lower and lower, I don't think for any good reason. I'm very happy to see it on the way back up again. So I think that's all I want to say about that, but it's a very valid area for a more detailed discussion some other time. Thank you. It's a good question. Sir, anybody? Nobody left? Yes, wait a second. I'll go over there. I don't think the lady in green back there.
What happened in the years following his death?
I'm sorry. You're going to have to go over there, Terry. It's not your voices, it's my ears, okay?
What happened in the years following his death to his family?
In his family? Well, that's a good question. I don't really know that much about it. Julia lived on into the 20th century, early in the 20th century, and lived a pleasant life between Washington, D.C. and New York City. And as for the others, his little granddaughter, who was in the carriage in the final parade with her mother and father, she became the Countess Kontazun. She married some Russian nobleman and just got out of Russia with the Russian Revolution, and wrote her memoirs, which happen to include some of the good stuff about her grandfather that appears in my book. Other than that, I should know more, but I really, it doesn't all come to me now. But another good question. Maybe by tomorrow I may be able to tell you something more. Okay, I think there's at least one more. Anybody else? Both you gentlemen have had questions. Anybody else back there? I'd like to be very happy to hear somebody I haven't heard from so far. Sir, please.
How would you rate Grant's handling of largesse from the general public and from the rich?
How would I rate it?
Yes.
Well, the first person who ever got a presidential pension was Harry S. Truman. Okay, so when you're a ex-president, you didn't get anything out of that. And Grant had something going back, and in fact, Grant's very penny-pinching father was mad at him when he ran for president, because that meant he might have to give up his pension as a general. You couldn't do both things. You couldn't apparently be president and still have your pension as a general. I think that was finally renegotiated to some extent. So give it to me again. How would I rate what?
How would you rate his handling of largesse by the high and mighty and by...
Well, there wasn't really that much largesse. I mean, the house that he owned, they had chipped in some money, which is a fraction. Those millionaires, it was not very much money to them. And I doubt that the whole works ever cost more than $300,000, granted that the buying power of the dollar was considerably more at the time. But I don't think, and I will say also, I don't think for a minute the grant was for sale. I mean, I'm not saying you're saying that, but the largesse, I don't see it as a big factor in his post-war life.
I wasn't casting aspersions on him, just because I've read so much about how his friends and admirers helped him. I just wondered.
Well, they'd helped. There's no question they helped, but I mean, I don't think. I just don't know. I mean, I've never addressed it quite that way, but I think that, and it certainly isn't the only time in history that people have come forward trying to give houses or something else. Eisenhower being a case in point. But I think I'm going to have to let that go. But I don't see him. Certainly, the public was not going to let him starve. But I think since it became known that these big guys who had yachts worth 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 times or whatever it was, any one of these houses, I just don't think that. And when he did go broke, there were some very interesting gifts, small gifts, coming in from people, including Confederate veterans and so forth, just saying, we hear you're broke, we want to help you out. So there was that too, whether you want to call that public largesse or small donations, I don't know. But again, an entirely valid question, but I just haven't ever really put it under that particular part of the microscope. All right, anybody else? Yes, sir, okay.
Well, Grant went from a drunken payroll officer to the leading general war. How do you explain his character? Where did that come from?
You mean the ability to be both things in one lifetime? I mean, is that the question? Okay. Well, all I can say is that I think he's still frank occasionally. All I'm saying is it never got in the way of what he did, and then of what he did when it was important. And there's also a pretty interesting coincidence that when his staff could get Julia, and she was often up where the cannons were booming, when they could get her there, they would do so. Now, whether that was to head off possible drinking, whatever. And she was right in some pretty tight situations at Vicksburg and on the James River, and so forth. And she was always a terrific trooper in every way. And she would come, and under one circumstance, that he was busy writing some orders because a Confederate ironclad was trying to break down and come opposite where he and Julia's headquarters were at City Point. And she very quietly was watching him smoke like as she put it, like a steam engine, and writing out these orders to deal with this. And she said, and Ulysses, what should I do? And he looks around, and as if he'd forgotten she was there, and said, well, really, Julia, you shouldn't be at all. And in her memoir, she said, and he was the one who sent for me, mind you. So, but I think that's about all I can give you on that. Okay, thank you all very, very much. Okay.